Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Welcome to Session 3 of this third biennial HIA meeting. Session 3 is entitled On Paper, Poetry, and Painting, and we're going to continue looking closely, but we're also going to be looking widely, as is the theme of this meeting. Closely at the techniques of one of the great paper works, paper-making techniques of the 16th century onward, equally closely at a painting in one celebrated 16th century Persian manuscript, and then very widely, as if we've pulled the camera back and are really looking widely, at the work of a 20th century Turkish painter and the influences upon his work that came widely from the other end of the Mediterranean. And because this is so particularly disparate a session, again, questions will come after each paper. I would like, lastly, to say that as we've all been out to lunch, please turn off your devices or put them onto vibrate or silent or whatever is the appropriate mode, because you might not happen that you yourself get a call, as I have seen happen in meetings of this kind, but it would not be a good idea. Let me first then introduce Jake Benson, who is that rarity among us as art historians, a self-described conservator-trained curator. Jake is actually curator of the Thesaurus Islamicus and at the al-Kutub manuscript project in Cairo. He's a trained bookbinder and marbler. He studied graduate Persian at the University of Maryland. He has actually worked as a bookbinder at Harvard and at the Library of Congress, and I'm sure that he stunned people with a recent paper delivery in Istanbul on Ottoman and Indian marbled papers, and today he is going to talk to us about Naqsh Safavid marbled papers in the late 16th and early 17th century.
Thanks to the organizers of this conference for accepting my paper. This discussion of marbled papers and Islamic manuscripts, calligraphy and painting, has largely focused on two distinct arenas, Ottoman Turkey and the Deccan in India. This paper is the second part of one I presented at the International Society of Iranian Studies this summer in Istanbul that aims to draw attention to Persianate marbling, which I believe is the ultimate source for both the Ottoman and Deccani traditions. That particular paper focused on textual sources, while today I will take a closer look at the physical evidence. First, just to describe what is marbled paper. It's a decorative art in which color is floated on the surface of a liquid bath, manipulated, and a piece of paper is laid over top to capture the design. Historically, it was called kağaz-i abri, literally meaning clouded paper, or simply abri in Persian, though today it is often called abrubad in Iran and Ebru in Turkey. This art form has existed in the Persianate world for at least 500 years and was used to embellish manuscripts, book bindings, and calligraphy. And I just want to mention that while it's commonly called Ebru today, because of the prevalence of the term in Turkey, there really is no evidence for this word, Ebru, in any of the earlier historical literature, except for one reference to tiles that Guru Najibullah has found. So, it's also often combined with other decorative techniques such as illumination and gilding. One tiny thing I'd like to discuss, though, before I proceed with Persianate marbling is some of the prevailing literature has described a connection between marbling in the Islamic world and in China. And I just want to mention that this idea is actually very much inconclusive. There is an account from the Wenfang Tsepu of the Chinese scholar official Su Yijian, which mentions a kind of decorative paper, drifting sand paper, liu sha jian, and in which colors were sprinkled on the surface of a paste slurry which had been applied to the paper. And this paste slurry was made with either actual starch paste or mucilage of honey locust pods, and it created a kind of free and irregular design. And then this sheet may have been dragged through this solution, or it may have been applied to the top of it. But it wasn't actually a floating method of sprinkling color on a floating bath. So it's something that's important to distinguish in the various sources. There is a form of marbling that predates Islamic marbling, which is in Japan called sumi nagashi, which literally means floating ink. Color is floated on the surface of a water bath. The earliest examples date to the 12th century, the Heian era, but the origins are still very unclear and inconclusive. The evidence of these earlier East Asian modes of marbling have led some writers to try and connect the dots, and a theory emerged in the 80s that stressed that marbling may have originated in China and then very slowly evolved along the Silk Road, arriving in Central Asia. So this long, slow development has been reiterated in many different publications. But there really isn't any evidence to support this theory. So, this is a picture very briefly of Japanese marbling, where you can see the marbler is holding brushes that are loaded with color, and they touch the brush to the center of the bath and it forms a spot. One brush is loaded with black, the other with blue, and then a brush containing a negative color of water mixed with a surfactant. And you can see it creates these lines, these sort of irregular lines. It's very different from the kinds of marbling we see in the Persianate world. In discussing the origins of marbling, I should note that not everyone has agreed with this long, slow evolution, this idea of this long evolution. Francis Richard proposed that the advent of marbling possibly evolved from a kind of paper called coulée, which is called coulée in French. It's a kind of paste slurry paper, and it actually may be the paper that Su Yijian was referring to in the Wenfang Sopu. And this example you see here is from a Safina or Beyaz anthology from here at the Metropolitan Museum. It's a small detail showing you the kind of irregular designs that are created in this technique. But this is very much a surface decoration. This is not a method of floating color. The research for any kind of decorative paper is very challenging. Often you will find in publication that the decorative paper borders have been cropped off, and I've even seen examples of calligraphies or paintings which have had their decorative borders matted over before exhibition. I believe that such actions hinder the study of decorative papers and marginalia. The smudges of ink or water damage can also be mistaken for a swirl of marbling, and other methods of paper surface decoration, such as the coulée that I just showed, can often be confused with floating color marbling. Then there are problems presented by the pieces themselves. Borders are often added during later album construction, and end papers are often added when a book or a manuscript is rebound. In 1977, the Turkish calligraphy scholar Uğur Derman first outlined some of these problems and pitfalls in his seminal study, Türk Sanatında Ebru, in 1977. He described the unreliability of dating marbling based upon decorative borders and end papers. In his opinion, inscriptions and sign calligraphies written over marbled papers are the most reliable method of determining a date. So, Derman proposed that this kitab that we see here from his own collection, which is written over soft swirls of dark bluish-black marbling and signed by the Safavid master Maliki Daylami, who wrote it in Georgia in the winter of 1560, was the earliest example of marbled paper that Derman had found. Several panels attributed to Mir Ali Haravi, written over a similarly swirled marbled paper, were identified in several different collections in subsequent years. Originally from Herat and later working in Shayban at Bukhara, the identification of this piece, not this specific one, but several others, served to buttress the idea that marbling had originated in Central Asia. The pattern here, you see, features a softly swirled pattern of what appears to be indigo blue, and it's quite similar to the previous image. Since then, several more panels ascribed to the same master came to light, such as this one from the Chester Beatty Library. Mir Ali's choice of marbled paper for writing was something imitated by his students and later generations of calligraphers, and due to his fame, his pieces were collected far and wide, thereby probably helping popularize the use of marbled paper by calligraphers. interestingly enough, one panel here at the Metropolitan, also attributed to Mir ʿAlī, is from the Shah Jahan album. And when I first saw this, I was very excited because the pattern is a little bit different than the others that we've seen so far. It's actually a kind of spotted pattern. But unfortunately, if you look really closely at the signature here, you'll notice that there's a small cut line. And the pattern, I've enhanced it a bit, but you can see they clearly don't match. And so the signature was actually added to the calligraphy panel, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. But unfortunately, those are the kinds of problems that you run into when you try and study these decorative techniques. New evidence for early marbling then surfaced in the 90s with the acquisition of a pair of leaves by the Kronos collection here in New York City. These leaves challenge prevailing views of marbling for several reasons. One leaf is marbled on both sides, while the other bears a Persian inscription in Talik script stating, "Yadashte in abrihaye nadire." Note that these rare marble papers, and the inscription continues that they were brought as a gift from the land of Iran and accessioned by the Royal Library of Sultan Ghiyath-ud-Din Khalji of Mandu on the 1st of Zulhijjah, 901, corresponding to 1497. If we accept this date, this is the very first example of the use of the word abri, obviously referring to marbled paper in a Persian text. The marble designs are both carefully outlined in gold ink and also dusted with gold powder. This date happens to coincide with one brief account concerning the late Timurid figure from Herat, Abdullah Morvarid. The calligrapher Mahmud bin Muhammad wrote a short passage about him in his work, the Qawaid al-Khutut, which was written in circa 960, 1553. While Muhammad bin Mahmud was not a contemporary of Abdullah Morvarid, he knew his son Muhammad Mu'min, who was then the director of the Royal Library under the Safavid Shah Tahmasp. Mahmud wrote that the master Abdullah Morvarid, known by the pen name of Bayani, was a calligrapher of the High Divan. Among his inventions are afshan, ghubar, and then rang amizi abr qagaz. So afshan meaning speckled or sprinkled paper, and ghubar meaning dust, referring to a kind of gold dusting, and then mixed color cloud paper. Ironically, the marbled motifs on the leaves from the Kronos collection feature are both outlined in gold and flecked with this ghubar or gold dust. In the past, scholars like Ur Darman thought that such motifs didn't appear until as much as 2 centuries later. Yet in thinking further about the marbling process, I note that in any system of marbling, whether it's water-based or performed on the surface of a mucilage or size, a single drop of color will always expand to form a drop. And to bisect that drop with a stylus or a needle or something else is not necessarily a particularly advanced technique, as Darman had implied. So this piece is very challenging, and it forces me to question the prevailing assumption that the earliest marble papers were all soft and swirled. And in fact, if anything, that the focus on calligraphy panels may in fact be engendering a kind of bias that the calligraphers themselves had for soft, pale, and swirled marbled papers. That's what they like to use. It's not to say that that was the only kind of marbling that existed. So this piece is very provocative for these reasons. There's further evidence for some of this kind of marbling that's very different than what scholars like Darman have discussed. And this particular mashq panel, which is in a private collection in Iran, signed by Ikhtiyar Munshi, meaning the Ikhtiyar Munshi who lived in Herat and worked for Shah Muhammad Khudabanda, is also similarly laid out in rows, like the previous pieces in the Kronos collection. The bottom row you see here is a very bold sort, but actually stylistically a very similar kind of motif to the previous Kronos pages, whereas the 2 upper bands are a form of rudimentary comb marbling. I still think that even though these aren't very close in time, but they're within half a century, and we do know that he lived in Herat, that it may in fact helped to confirm that this was a type of marbling that was being practiced at that time. Small bisected spots are often found in marginal albums as well, and some of them are quite early, although I wouldn't go so far as to say they're contemporary to this piece. But here's a Timurid drawing, which was then mounted into an album. This is from the Pozzi collection, which is now in Geneva. But there are many other examples of this sort of thing, a very small motif that has been bisected in the border, very gently bisected, forming a kind of heart or leaf shape. A similar pattern is also readily identified in several Turkish and Indian manuscripts dating to the second half of the 16th century, and it indicates that this kind of marbling, using these very small bisected spots, is something that had become quite widespread in the Eastern Islamic world. These are two panels written by the calligrapher Shah Mahmud Nishapuri, the one on the left from the Khalili collection, and the one on the right from the Institute for Oriental Studies in St. Petersburg. The one on the right is actually dated 965 or 1557, corresponding to the time that Shah Mahmud is described to have retired to Mashhad. Ironically, Qazi Ahmed Qumi, in his Gulistani Hunar, mentions that his teacher, Muhammad Amin, who worked as a jadvalkash in the atelier of Sultan Ibrahim Mīrzā at Mashhad, was also a marbler. I'm not saying that he made these works, but it's possible that there's a connection. Several pieces attributed to Mashhad at this time have come to light that may possibly also be the work of this master, which brings me to a major focus of my paper today. Calligraphers weren't the only ones to use decorative papers, and the margins of drawings and paintings are often a place that we find different kinds of decorative papers. And this pair of paintings featuring a scene of a royal hunt or hawking party split between the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and then this leaf from the Metropolitan, both feature a kind of spotted style that is similar to what we saw in the panels by Shah Mahmud. When I first saw these leaves, I noticed something very curious about them. Along the bottom edge, you can observe how flowing water in the internal margin appears to spill down and join up with the marbling in the outer border. The flowing water cleverly connects the inner and outer borders, and on close inspection, you can see that the marginal ruling may have even been rubbed away to kind of intentionally enhance that effect. Contemplating the image further, I noticed that the placement and orientation of the creatures in the inner margin seemed to reflect the contours of the marbling in the outer borders, such as this Keelan here, who seems almost to leap up from these rocks below, or this leopard who is climbing upon these water-strewn rocks and trying to climb up the side. Continuing on, you see a similar kind of parallel between the shape, the contour of the marbling here, and this Keelan climbing upward here. This dragon and the very wavy form at the upper left, and then this simurgh with his flourishing tail and the kind of flourish that you see here. All of these seem to be very carefully positioned and placed in line, and indicating that the painter was very probably inspired by the marbled paper when they conceived of illuminating this inner border. The marbling inspired the artist is highly evident in this Persian composite drawing from the Sackler at Harvard. While different scholars have debated the exact date and location for its production, the contours of the marbled pattern itself clearly was the muse for the artist's imagination. A profusion of small human figures appeared to ebb and flow among various animals, birds, fish, and butterflies, as if intentionally designed to astonish and perhaps tantalize the viewer. Two letters addressed to Mir Muhammad Ṭayr, a Persian marbler who had sought his fortune in India, confirmed that marbling was viewed as something strange, wondrous, and astonishing. The first author is only known from this collection of documents copied in the Malik Library in Tehran. In his letter, he describes how the papers of this man, Mir Muhammad Ṭayr, are so astonishing to everyone in Ardabil that the lord of the shrine, Zulfikar Khan Karamanlu, who was appointed by Shah Abbas as the Mutawali, the guardian of the shrine in 1593 till his death in 1610. He commanded that they make similar papers for his manuscripts. He describes the Mir as a painter of the sublime mind who without the necessary means of a brush, makes thousands of diverse shapes and different designs upon the surface of water, the effects of which are a reflection of those imaginary likenesses and non-existent immaterial manifestations that are displayed to the view of observers. And basically, the Mullah Khalil, is begging the Mir to send instructions for his methods of marbling. In contrast to Mullah Khalil, of whom little is known, Qazi Ahmed Qumi describes the second artist as a highly accomplished marbler. Our master Yahya is from Qazvin. In attaching borders, coloring paper, and abri papers, he is exceptional, has made several favorable innovations. The letter contains a chronogram dating it to 1600-1601. In it, he too mentions the order of the Khan to make similar papers, and he describes his struggles to make them himself and how he has improved with the instructions that the Mir has sent, and he's sending samples of his own work for the Mir to review. Quite curiously, the Metropolitan Museum has a wonderful manuscript of the Manṭiq Ṭayr, which feature very bold, vivid marbled papers that are very different than what we've seen in the previous examples. Instead of just 3 or 4 colors, up to a dozen are used. They are very vivid and brilliant, indicating that a high density of paint was successfully floated and transferred to the sheet, whereas previous papers are quite pale by comparison. Thirdly, intricately stylized, very sharp and clear lines of color and tight veining indicate that the colors were expertly refined and prepared, likely through a process of repeated grinding and levigation. Finally, the resulting papers are well formed in that they have an even placement and coverage, and pattern complexity displays a level of sophistication that we didn't see in the earlier papers. These papers were added to this Timurid manuscript when it was restored in the Safavid period, and an inscription stating that they were illuminated in Isfahan led many to assume that that was where the marbled papers were made and added. But this evidence from Ardabil suggests otherwise. You can see here some of the very, very fine detail of the style of marbling at that time. And what's especially important about this is that the Waqf seal spans both the inner text and the outer margin, proving that these marbled papers were added before the accession date of 1608-09. In contrast to this is another very similar manuscript of the Makhzan al-Asrar of Khwarazmi in Topkapi Palace, which has a similar style of pattern. But here again, all of the designs have been outlined in gold, similar to the chronos leaves. And this interesting painting from the Pozzi collection of a young gathering enjoying a sunny summer afternoon seems visually enhanced by the gold-flecked and outlined bands of clouds, which are then superimposed by golden birds. And I want to end today with a small leaf in honor of Carrie Welch, Stuart Carey Welch, who I owe a great deal to for helping to encouraging me to study marbling. And this is a leaf that was formerly in his own collection. We don't really know where it comes from, but it's possibly Indian or Iran. And what is interesting about this particular leaf is that it was largely unfinished. It was outlined and marginal ruling added, but only this verse was written. The verse reads, "Ma dar in bagh nahal chaman tasviram ast dar khame Naqsh rag u rishe ma," meaning, we are in a garden of samplings of the meadow of our picture. The entire fiber of our being is in the brush of the painter. It's an interesting allusion to some 30 poems that I've been now working on that allude to marbled paper. Most of these poems were written in the 17th century by what have been called the Sabki Hindi poets. These are Iranian poets who were inspired by India. Many of them traveled there. Some of them even relocated there. And some 30 poems have been written that mention marbled paper, and some of them reflecting this kind of sentiment, although not all of them are quite so positive. In conclusion, marbled papers have long been used as a form of decoration in Persianate manuscripts, but tracing the origin of the art is tricky. While more research is required before we can make any firm conclusions, these specific examples provide us with compelling insight into how marbled papers were made, evolved, and how the aesthetic qualities of the papers were used and viewed by artists and members of the Safavid elite. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake, for compressing, for ending so splendidly. What my immediate thought was, nobody in our world will ever mount a painting or a calligraphy without showing the entire folio, because we have treasures of the kind that you have revealed to us. Questions? Please, the microphone is there. And Jake, when you answer, you either have to go here or,
Okay.
yeah. Or
this?
This?
Okay, all right.
Thank you. You mentioned one of the calligraphy with the signature of Mir ʿAlī, and you said that the signature aid later. This is correct.
Yeah.
The signature is fake. You decide according to the Abrubat. But when I see it, I said it's fake because the word faqir is without alif lam. It must have alif lam. Then if you see any calligraphy without al, you must be careful of the signature. The signature must. There is a large difference between faqir and al-faqir. Of course, the al is alam, but the faqir, it means he is a real poor person. But when you say al-faqir, maybe he have a large wealth, but he make himself humble. For this, that's correct. Only I want to add this, that without alif lam, the signature is fake.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's definitely a big problem. When I first, I didn't even show the leaves that first drew attention to Mir ʿAlī because I'm actually convinced now that they're not authentic. But they were the first leaves from an album which is in the Istanbul University Library, which caused a lot of excitement when they were discovered. But there's a lot of problem with famous calligraphers especially. But it's one of the reasons why I think the Kronos piece is so compelling, because that inscription doesn't actually relate it to somebody famous. I mean, Sultan Ghiyathuddin Khalji was a well-known provincial ruler who had reportedly an interesting, a wonderful library. But it's not as though they were trying to establish that that was the work of Abdullah Mor Farīd himself. So, it's interesting, these inscriptions, and analyzing them.
I fear, if we're going to stick to schedule, that this has to be the last question. And so I'm going to thank you, Jake, for a really superb introduction beginning into this session, and call upon Fatemeh Montazeri.